this is a day before we mark the first anniversary, the first commemoration of the atrocities of 10/7 and what ensued after 10/7. And I think it is appropriate to talk about how Israelis see things. And I prepared for you some slides, as I usually do, that will help you better have a visual image of what we're talking about. The first question I was asked by Debbie, and I'm starting the presentation with that, is what currently is the mood in Israel? And it's an interesting combination on of resilience on the one hand, combined with a great concern because of this unusually high degree of uncertainty. Now, in our region, uncertainty is part of the DNA of the region. It's part of the regional DNA. Uncertainty. You never know what's going to happen either in your country or in the neighboring countries. But um, but this combination is very unsettling. It makes people nervous, not knowing where things are heading, what's going to unfold. It can be, um, you know, dramatic changes that happen in a matter of days that can change the region for generations to come. And it can be more, less significant things. But here are the three things that you need to know about the Israelis these days. The first is Israelis are still living 10/7 every day. It makes this, and many American Jews and many of the people on this call still live 10/7 every day. What does it mean we live 10/7 every day? Stories, witnesses, testimonials come out every day. The Israeli television, the Israeli newspapers are feeding the public with stories related to the atrocity of 10/7 every day, all day. And so while the Israelis are still living 10/7, the world has moved on shortly after 10/7. And that gap is very difficult for the Israelis to accept the fact that the world has moved on. The world is now looking at other things. For example, Israel's response to 10/7. So that's the first thing you need to know about the mood in Israel. The Israelis are still stuck in 10/7, of course, for good reason. The second is unbelievable resilience. It's not something new, by the way. This is part of our DNA as a society. I remember when people were visiting Israel during the high days of the Second Intifada, when buses were exploding left and right. There were 550 attempts to carry out suicide bombing missions in 5 years. 150 of them or so were quote unquote successful, that created massive damage. 63% of all of Israel's fatalities during the 5 years of the Second Intifada were as a result of suicide bombing. And I remember visitors would tell me, we can't believe how quickly the Israelis rehabilitated and restored the establishments that were attacked. For example, Mike's Place, the famous pub in Tel Aviv that was attacked in April of 2003. And usually Jack Baxter, who's a survivor of this attack, is on these calls. I don't know if Jack and Fran are on the call today, but if they are, please raise your hand and I'll acknowledge your presence. But Jack Baxter told me that they made a decision after he got out of the hospital. He nearly died. Um, they made a decision to open the pub within 30 days, and they did. And the famous story about the bus driver in Jerusalem, whose bus was attacked at 8 a.m. in the morning, killing 18 people. And the first thing the psychologist told him is that you need to go to work as soon as possible. So he started working that day at 2 p.m. again. So his bus was attacked at 8 p.m. He survived the attack. And he went back to work the same day, the same afternoon. That's resilience. And then, of course, uncertainty. Uncertainty, not just about we don't know what Hamas will do next. We don't know what Hezbollah would do next. We don't know what Iran would do next. The biggest fear of Israel and Israelis like myself is we don't know what the West, headed by the United States, will do next. That's the fear. That's the uncertainty. Will the Americans have the appetite, the ability to grasp the greatness of that moment? Or the Americans will have their own considerations, and which, the American system can produce um, different decisions, different outcomes. Let me remind you, 9/11 was carried out by Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda essentially is no different than Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthi organization. These are all offsprings of radical Islamic doctrine espoused by the uh, revolutionary regime in Iran. Yet, which country was chosen as the prime target of the Americans? Iraq. Wrong answer to the question of who should have been punished for 9/11. And we've said it here before. Think about what kind of Middle East we could have faced today had George W. Bush made the right decision after 9/11 and not the wrong decision. And making that wrong decision of attacking Iraq rather than Iran is something that keeps on haunting all of us. Why? Because the perceived failure of the war in Iraq, although militarily it was not a failure, politically it was a failure, but not militarily, is one of the prime reasons why the American public lost the appetite to deploy power. So that decision, that bad decision made by the Americans, keeps on haunting our region until this very day. Not to mention the fact that Saddam Hussein actually represented exactly the opposite of what the radical extremists, the Islamists, are representing. The Ba'ath Party was a secular party, essentially, not that they were a bunch of angels. So this is the mood in Israel, a very bizarre combination of resilience and uncertainty, fear. I would say, if there's one word to describe, I would say it's somber. Israelis are not celebrating. I celebrate my birthday in August, and this year, and every person that sent me birthday congratulations, I answered, I don't feel like celebrating. And that's, I think, the prevailing mood in Israel. I said it before and I'll say it again. As we mark the first year, the first commemoration to the atrocity of 10/7, it's important to put things in perspective. Israeli politicians like to compare this to 1948, and they say it's an existential threat, and it could be in an extreme scenario an existential threat, but it's not 1948. In 1948, Israel was helpless, defenseless. We didn't have the resources. The perception in the United States, especially in the United States, was that Israel has no chance of surviving. I remember the issue of Life magazine from May 30th, 1948, which still exists. You can buy it on Amazon. They sent several reporters to cover the war in the Middle East, and those reporters came to the conclusion that Israel has no chance. and they viewed the newly established Jewish state as an experiment that is doomed to fail. And it is doomed to fail because at the time, Israel had no institutional support from the United States, from the Soviet Union, the big two powers of the world at the time. Of course, the Brits wouldn't help us. The only countries that were helping us, the help was largely diplomatic, like Canada, um, like Brazil or the Czech Republic. But the only people that helped us financially were American Jews, and mostly American Jews, but also South African Jews, Australian Jews, and so on. And people did not believe that Israel would survive, and Israel did. And not only that Israel survived, Israel flourished. And so today, 2024, and I think that's evident when you see the performance of the IDF since 10/7, that Israel has not only a very mighty military force, but also very sophisticated military force, and that Israel's security establishment is highly creative, perhaps the best in the world. When you see the performance, it's really unbelievable performance. Although Israel never took responsibility, I think it's safe to assume that Israel is behind some of the most heroic, creative, and sophisticated intelligence operations. Um, and um, and we see the results today. Now, we are experiencing indeed a multi-front war. If you remember at the session that we held right after 10/7, I presented the scenario of a multi-front war as the Iranian fantasy. This was the fantasy of the Iranians. And the Iranians deployed a philosophy called the Ring of Fire, meaning let's surround Israel by several proxies. Each can agitate and inflict harm in a significant way, may not be existential. But if you deploy all of them combined, all of them simultaneously, that's the Iranian philosophy, you may be able to bring down the Jewish state. So here's a list of this is the Ring of Fire, right? It's attributed, the phrase attributed to Qasem Soleimani that was taken out a couple of years ago. So Hamas attacking from the south. Hamas was hoping that immediately all the other proxies will join in. Indeed, Hezbollah started attacking on October 8th. So when people say, why is Israel attacking Hezbollah? Here's the answer. Hezbollah started attacking unprovoked on October 8th. So you had Hamas, Hezbollah, then the Houthis joined in from Yemen. Now, the Houthis are much larger than Hamas and Hezbollah is much larger than Hamas. Then you had disturbances which did not amount to a full intifada in the West Bank, but it's getting there. It's getting there. There's a lot of unrest in the West Bank. We had several terrorist attacks in Israel in the last several days that came from the West Bank, Hebron. Then we haven't seen that threat yet so actively, but Syrian pro-Iranian militias in Syria, operating in Syria. Arab Israelis, it's a big problem. We just had a terrorist attack carried out by an Arab Israeli the other day from the south. And lastly, Iran, that historically and traditionally kept out of actual military engagement against Israel, attacked Israel directly twice. The first time in April and the second time several days ago. And both attacks failed miserably, and we can, during the Q&A session, we can talk about why they failed. And Iran is actually quite vulnerable. A lot of people don't realize that. But this is really the menu. And Iran's hope was that the deployment of all those elements simultaneously could bring Israel down. It did not happen for many, many reasons, which we can discuss, but it did not happen. This is the Iranian fantasy of a multi-front war. And the danger, of course, of such a war for Israel is, emanating from the fact that first, the IDF is designed to fight short wars, meaning the engagement, the military engagement, has to be limited in time, preferably predetermined, meaning you decide how much time you allocate to a certain military task. And the second is that the longer the military engagement is, the more reliant Israel is on the United States and other suppliers of munitions and equipment, because you have to understand those airplanes that you see here on this slide, they need repair. These are not machines that can run forever. And especially when you deploy them to attack Yemeni targets, which are 2,000 kilometers away, for how long do you think tiny Israel can, attack targets? We're not the United States. We don't have, aircraft carriers all over the world. And so without the help of the United States, we are pretty much limited in what we can achieve militarily, because our military is small in absolute numbers and our Air Force is small in absolute numbers. It is bigger than the Egyptian Air Force, but it's not a huge Air Force in absolute numbers. And we have to understand that. Israel cannot spread itself too much, because then we lose the ability to concentrate effort. Hostages are still on the minds of every Israelis, and we are paying the price of the failure to tackle the hostage issue um, adequately in the very beginning. As you remember, we spoke about it from purely a crisis management point of view. What Israel should have done on October 8th, before considering, certainly before deploying any military, but even before considering military action, is to announce that this is a hostage first crisis, and that the goal is first to release all hostages. And what the Israeli government should have done, and we said it here before, is, put the onus on the other side by saying, we agree to a full hostage deal, meaning all Israeli hostages back, in return all Palestinian prisoners. Because that would have been the right thing to do, because the Hamas defeated Israel on October 7th. There is no way around it. There is no way around it. That's what happened on October 7th. Israel was defeated. We lost control over an entire region of our country for nearly 24 hours. It was taken over by an enemy. It's a declaration of war, but it's also a defeat. And the first stage in recovering from the defeat is the ability to admit to oneself that you were defeated. And we didn't do that. Now, if we had done that, if we had said to the world, this is the deal on the table on October 8th, bring back 250 Israeli hostages, and we will release all Palestinian prisoners. Even if Hamas had said no to that offer, that would have given Israel the international legitimacy to do whatever it needed to do in Gaza. But we didn't do that. We didn't do that. And today, we find ourselves in the very frustrating situation, whereas there is a conflict between the need to continue the military campaign, and make no mistake, the Israeli leadership wants the head of Sinwar. They want to, this is their victory image, and the release of the hostages. So, interestingly, Sinwar has no reason to release any hostages now, because it's the only leverage he has. Once the hostages are released, and by the way, we're being told that he is somewhere deep underground, surrounded by hostages, right? Because he thinks that's his insurance part. Who's opposing the release of the hostages in Israel? Usually the radical right. They say, it's a secondary consideration. The main consideration in historical terms is to eradicate Hamas. And we discussed here before, eradicating Hamas is not a realistic goal. You can cripple their military capacity, which is largely what Israel has done successfully in the last year. What needs to happen for the hostages to be released? First of all, there has to be the political will. Right now, we don't see the political will, not in Israel and not, of course, among the Palestinians in Gaza. And Israeli leaders are looking for this elusive image of victory. I don't know if you guys remember George W. Bush arriving in Iraq, taking a picture with there's a big sign behind it, mission accomplished. And I don't know if you remember how ridiculed he was for that, because this was really the wrong timing to claim that mission was accomplished in Iraq. And all in all, thousands of American soldiers died after he made that statement that mission was accomplished. But leaders, political leaders, are programmed to claim credit, are programmed to put themselves at the center, they're programmed to think short term. There's very little strategy in the thinking of a politician that needs to be reelected. And that brings you to where we are today. Plus, don't forget that Israel, the politicians, not only in Israel, all over the world, are checking the pulse of the public, or the mood of the public, almost on a daily basis, sometimes 2 and 3 times per day. And they think they have a good understanding of what the public wants. It's a big problem. What does it say about leadership? If leaders are addicted to public opinion surveys, what does it mean? It means that they're not really leading by their own conviction, but rather they're being led by what the public wants. So the public sentiment, the popular sentiment becomes the leader. But it's a different discussion about the impact of technology on politics. But Israeli leaders see the public opinion surveys, and they see that the Israeli public is in support in huge numbers in continued military campaign in several fronts. The Israelis are very adamant about the need to seize the moment to bring the Iranian revolutionary regime to an end. Again, not that it's a realistic goal. I'm not so sure that the Israeli public knows what's best for Israel, but that's how Israeli decision-making system operates. Now, the danger of what has happened in the last year, the danger of the failure to release the hostages, is that it inflicts direct and massive damage to the number one principle, which is Israel's secret sauce: mutual responsibility. In Hebrew, we say arevut hadadit. What is mutual responsibility is what brought David Ben-Gurion say in his famous speech that he used the term Hebrew mother, but he meant every Israeli mother or every Jewish mother, should know that when you send your child to the Israeli army, which Ben-Gurion viewed to be the heart of independence, the manifestation of independence is the ability to defend yourself. And it's not called the Israel Offense Forces. It's called the Israel Defense Forces. There's a reason why he used the word defense and not offense. Every mother that sends her child to the army should know that the state of Israel will do its utmost, whatever it needs to do, to protect that child. A boy or a girl, it doesn't matter. That was a principle. I remember when I joined the Israeli army in the summer of 1980, that sentence from that speech by Ben-Gurion greeted us as we entered the military base for our basic training. It was right there in front of us. He entered the military base. My first time as a soldier in a military base. This is my new home. I'm 18 years old, and I'm being greeted by that big statement on a sign in the military base. It says, Ben Gurion is talking to you, right? So the danger of what we have seen, the danger of the failure of the Israeli government to bring back the hostages is a threat to Israel's survival because this is Israel's secret sauce. Now, if we have people, for whatever reason, it could be their messianic belief, their messianic understanding of Judaism, which I think is a completely distortion of Judaism, and they have the upper hand in the coalition, what it means is that people will lose trust in that very notion. That's dangerous. If the turnout on October 8th to reserve duty was 150%, in other words, the Army got more soldiers than it needed, then today the turnout in Lebanon is around 75%. There's a shortage of 25% reservists. That explains what happened between October 8th and Lebanon. The same kids, reservists, that were happy to go for 6, 7 months of reserve duty. Like my son went to the South, he was there for 5 months. Now he was called again to Lebanon. Um, you know, it's a huge difference in the circumstances. And during that year, the same government that sent them to Gaza and is sending them now to Lebanon is working diligently to allow the ultra-Orthodox to continue to be the free riders of Israeli society, meaning we want to take, we don't want to give. Right? And humanity and civilization struggles throughout history what to do with free riders in every society, what to do with the people in our group, in our community that want to take, but they don't want to give back. What to do with them? It's a big problem. If you look at every society, every culture has to deal with its own problem of free riding. And we have a huge problem in Israel with the ultra-Orthodox. These are our free riders, the people that are part of society, but they don't act like part of society. So there are positives and negatives. Let me quickly run through them, and then we'll open the floor for your questions. So the first positive, it's a huge positive, is that Arab solidarity, which was viewed by the founders of the Zionist movement as the number one threat to Israel's existence, hasn't happened. And the reason why there is no Arab solidarity, meaning the Arab system did not stand as one in support of Hamas. There are many reasons for it. But the nightmare of Arab solidarity hasn't happened. And let me explain how big of a problem Arab solidarity has been for the Zionist movement since its very inception. So Pan-Arabism is the ideology that is a product of the Arab solidarity, I would call it fantasy. So it's Pan-Arabism is an ideology that basically says there is one common interest to all Arab countries, and therefore we should act accordingly and work together. We should be united. And even at one point, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the big champion of Pan-Arabism, in 1958 actually created an entity that brought together Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. And it was a secular entity, by the way. It was not an Islamist entity. It was called UAR. It was a short-lived experience, but perhaps the biggest achievement of Pan-Arabism, meaning the ability to act together is on behalf of some united Arab interest, was, of course, the Arab economic boycott of 1945 that was declared and implemented and executed 3 years before Israel became independent. And that Arab boycott was, a lot of people now complain about the boycott on campus and all that. It's a walk in the park next to what our parents had to deal with in 1945. The Arab economic boycott was all encompassing. And the danger in that boycott was not those who explicitly said that they were boycotting Israel. Because then, in those cases, then you knew, okay, then I'm not going to consider the Arab world or the Muslim world as a market for the little bit economy that we had here. But the problem was those who implicitly complied with the boycott, among them, most American corporations. Most American corporations shied away from Israel because of the Arab economic boycott. And even today, when you see big American brands contemplating not doing business in Israel, the main reason for them not to do business in Israel and to shy away from Israel and to be very sensitive to any criticism of Israel is because they're afraid of losing the market in the Muslim world. So, for example, it was reported that McDonald's bought the license to operate their restaurants in Israel from the Israeli owner of the rest of the license in order to be able to control directly the restaurants and not through a mediator, not through a local mediator. And they say it had nothing to do with the criticism of Israel's response to 10/7, but we think it has everything to do with it. McDonald's is in control of their brand right now in Israel, and if they want, they can close the restaurants any given moment. And we're being told that the owner of the Israeli restaurants was criticized by the anti-Israel mob because he promised free meals to every Israeli soldier, and he became a target of the anti-Israel crowd. So that's just one example, but the Arab economic boycott of 1945, which ultimately turned Israel into startup nation because it forced Israel to look for new markets. In Israel's case, it was Europe, which is still Israel's largest um, export market, North America, and Southeast Asia. Uh, but more importantly, it pushed Israel to develop a knowledge based economy because we knew we were boycotted by our immediate neighbors. We cannot do business with any of our neighbors. Our only outlet is the ocean, the Mediterranean, and therefore our relative advantage should be based on our ability to produce knowledge and knowledge that matters. This was the vision of Theodor Herzl. This was the vision of Albert Einstein that came to Jerusalem in 1923 to build the Hebrew University, the first Israeli university. This is way before Israel became independent. And 1926, Einstein was also instrumental in the creation of the Technion, and both Hebrew University and the Technion are excellent institutions in the top 100 institutions in the world. And I'll show you some information about Israel's academic excellence. Um, and that's directly a byproduct of the decision of the Arabs to boycott Israel. So when you look at the boycotts today, universities are considering to divest from Israel. It's a walk in the park next to what our parents' generation had to deal with. Because back in 1948, we had nothing. There was no economy. There was no export. And yet the Arabs were united in their desire to suffocate the tiny, fragile Jewish presence in Palestine at the time of 480,000 Jews. In 1948, was 550,000 Jews. And after the War of Independence, it became 600,000. But Very, very small. The importance of making peace with Egypt was that it broke Arab solidarity. The Arab solidarity meant also de facto that the Palestinians, not that the Arabs really care about the Palestinians, make no mistake, they don't really care about them. If they had cared about the Palestinians, they would have done something with Palestinian refugees. Think about this. World War II created a problem of about 20 million refugees. All of them were settled, including over 1 million Jewish refugees from Arab countries. The only group of refugees whose status has not been settled since 1945 are the Palestinians. Why? Because it serves a political interest of someone. Now, the Palestinians traditionally held a veto power on normalization between Israel and the Arab world. Making peace with Egypt, the most important Arab country, the Arab country that really generated under Gamal Abdel Nasser, who died in 1970, generated the idea of pan-Arabism. Making peace with Egypt was a huge blow to the notion of Arab solidarity. And you see, Hamas is attacking on 10/7, other than lip service. Most Arab countries, with the exception of Qatar and non-Arab countries, of course, Russia, Turkey, and South Africa joined the anti-American axis. To a lesser degree, China. We'll talk about China in a second, but it's important to understand that the vast majority of Arab leaders are not standing behind Hamas. They're not even standing behind the Palestinians. They want to act according to their own self-interest. Very, very important to understand that it's a big achievement of Israel that Israel's response to 10/7 did not generate a renewed sentiment of let's be united against the evil called Zionism. It's not happening. The Arab world is not supportive of Hamas. The Arab world is not supportive of Hezbollah. On the contrary, when Israel took out Nasrallah, people were cheering throughout the Arab world. Very important to remember that. Second positive is that, as I mentioned before, we suffered a major blow, unprecedented blow on October 7th, but the performance of Israel's military and Israel's intelligence community since October 7th pretty much restored Israel's deterrence. What is a deterrent? A deterrent is the things you do that are designed to prevent your adversary, your enemy, from doing things that will harm you. And the deterrent can be a very mighty military capacity or simply a declaration about your intent. It could be a deterrent. But the deterrence is a very tricky game, as we discussed here before. I always like to give the example of the parents that drive to the vacation with their children sitting in the back of the car, and the children are yelling and screaming, and then the parents turn to the children and they say, if you will not stop right now, we're turning back and we're going home and no vacation, no Disneyland for you. And that's a deterrent. And you do that to establish deterrence. The danger is, and that's why deterrent is a risky game, what happens if after you threaten the children, they continue to yell and scream in the car? Then what? And I think we are at that moment. We are in the moment of establishing deterrence. And I think that the world viewed what Israel did with admiration, because it really admirable of what Israel did to Hezbollah, and um, it's within a matter of 2 weeks, Israel completely changed the the situation in the region on a regional scale within 2 weeks, and it was a well carried out, well thought of plan. I guess it was planned for years to inflict major harm on the military capabilities of Hezbollah, and it was done in unprecedented fashion. That I'm sure that there are several Hollywood screenwriters that are writing the script right now about what happened in Lebanon in the last several weeks, and it really is amazing. But restoring your deterrence is not without risks, and the risk is, what if your target is still defiant? And I think this is what we're looking at right now. Uh, Hezbollah and Lebanon and Iran continue to be defiant. And Iran defies even the United States, not just Israel. The United States warned them, do not launch this missile attack against Israel, and they did. So, so what happened in the last year? So we took out Hamas's military capabilities. They're largely destroyed. We took out Hezbollah's top leadership. The organization is in disarray, although is able to inflict harm on Israel every day. And we're still not in a position to allow our Israeli refugees to return to their homes. Their number is estimated at about 70,000. After 10/7, the number was closer to 250,000 Israeli refugees if you consider the South and the North combined. Uh, what we see is the United States and the UK actively pursuing Houthi targets in the Gulf area, and the reason is because the Houthis are threatening global trade, and the United States cannot allow that to happen. What I like about the way the United States is approaching this is that they are constantly striving to form coalitions, which is something the Israelis don't do. Unfortunately, there is very little diplomacy being generated by this Israeli government. And the other good news is that at the end of the day, Iran did not prove to be a modern, effective military force. The first attack on April 13th, 320 items were launched against Israel. Most of them failed. Um, they didn't even hit any target. And the only known victim of the April 13th attack was a Bedouin girl in the Israeli Negev. And this attack, 181 ballistic missiles. A ballistic missile is far more dangerous than the other weapons that they have, because the flight time is significantly shorter. It's between 12 to 14 minutes. It's not guided, so it's not accurate. It's not a precision weapon. And the only known victim of that attack, 181 ballistic missiles, was a Palestinian from Gaza who happened to visit Jericho. So here, this is the bottom line of those two attacks that probably cost the Iranians billions of dollars. The only known victims are two Muslims, a Muslim girl who survived and a Muslim Palestinian who was killed. If it wasn't sad, it would have been funny that Iran, the great protector of Islam, the only thing they achieved with 400 items launched against Israel, 400 missiles and drones combined, are inflicting harm on two Muslims. Think about it, how symbolic it is. Now, Mr. Netanyahu did there something very, very smart, and he addressed the Iranian people directly, and he recorded a speech that was meant to be delivered to the Iranians directly, in which he told them the truth. He said, "You and us are both victims of the Iranian revolutionary regime. The Iranian people are being held hostage by a death cult that no one really understands the rationale of their hatred against Jews, because Islam was not, I was just reading a book about, how Islam actually viewed Judaism very favorably. And there's plenty of literature about the history of Islam and Judaism. And so this is a distortion of Islamic thought, which is designed to improve the positioning of Shiites within the predominantly Sunni Muslim world. So the Iranian Revolution is a religious revolution that has um, all the characteristics of an internal struggle within Islam. It's about Islam. It's not even about Israel. It's about Islam. But this distorted view that Jews, and by the way, the Islamists are not talking about Israelis, they're talking about Jews. When this Hamas terrorist, um, his phone call to his parents was recorded on 10/7. What did he say to his parents? He said, "Mom, Dad, be proud of me. I just killed 10 Jews." He didn't say 10 Israelis. He said, "Their blood is still on my hands." This is the language set by the Iranians. It's not a coincidence that in Iran, every year you have the largest conference about Holocaust denial. Every year in Iran. All right. So Netanyahu's move was very smart. Hopefully, his speech reached um, many Iranians. I hope so, because it was a very clever move to tell them you are also victims of the radical Islamist regime in Iran, and we have the same interest. That's what he was telling them. We have the same interest. Let's bring this regime to an end. Um, the challenge that Israel is facing is that post World War II, liberal democracies have gone soft, meaning they don't want to fight. And it's tragic. We were just talking about this is a sign of the beginning of the end of the American empire. Now, how does a country reach a level where people lose the desire to fight for what they care about? How did we end up here where younger people, younger generation, take for granted all the achievements of their country as well as their freedoms that are being given by the country? How did we reach that level? So there are several explanations to that. The first is called the plentitude explanation. Post World War II, and it's true that the 20th century was a very deadly century, but also a century of progress, especially when you look at medicine and life expectancy. Life expectancy went up because of medicine and vaccinations during the 20th century. And in fact, my grandchildren that were born last year, their life expectancy is going to be in the 90s. Whereas when I was born, life expectancy for men was in the 60s. And so it's incredible. But other than that, other than science, you have plentitude, meaning people were born into this. Um, there was no shortage of food post World War II in the Western world. Um, no shortage of money. If you look at the lifestyle, of people, we started being so comfortable that we started abusing the environment, hence climate change crisis. And most of the blame is put on the baby boomers. And I still qualify as a baby boomer, by the way. I was born in 1962. And I suspect that most of the people on the call are baby boomers. And the baby boomers were targeted by the younger generation as the generation that is responsible for this mess. And probably many of the people um, that lived recklessly and made reckless decisions on a policy level, on the national level in the Western world were baby boomers. I don't know if we can blame the entire baby boomer generation. But the fact of the matter is that as we got wealthier and wealthier, we became also soft. What does it mean, soft? Um, a survey that was conducted in the United States and in the UK among young people under 39 indicated that less than 25% of them answered positively to the question, if your country will be attacked, are you willing to fight? That's pretty disturbing, pretty alarming. These people are willing to fight for their um, pronouns, but they're not. Excuse me for a second. I have, for some reason, I have a problem here with my battery for some reason. Excuse me for a second. All right, now it's going to work. Apologies for that. So there are signs of social and cultural decadence. Um, um, it's very disturbing. And it's disturbing to Israel because Israel doesn't have the luxury of losing the appetite to fight for what you care about. We are looking at countries, especially the United States, where deploying power, any power, police or military, is being viewed as illegitimate. I mean, the whole conversation of defunding police. In some quarters of American society, they're talking actually about abolishing police. It's insanity. Yet it becomes a mainstream conversation. Now, this is the main challenge Israel is facing. America lost the appetite to fight. For Israel, it's an existential threat when America doesn't want to fight because we cannot take out Iran by ourselves. And here, Israel designed a rare historical opportunity to bring down the Iranian regime, to take out the head of the snake. And we find ourselves alone. For whatever reason, no one is interested in rising to the occasion. So the risks that we are facing is that the United States will be reluctant to act against Iran. And by the way, I don't want to go into politics, but neither Trump nor Biden did anything against Iran. When the Iranians attacked Saudi targets, inflicting major harm on Saudi Arabia, President Trump did absolutely nothing militarily to respond. Now, if the efforts will fail to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear actor, given what we know about Iran's motivations, and look at what they did in April and look at what they did a few days ago, do you have any doubt whatsoever that if they had nuclear weapons, they would have used them? Of course, they would have used them. There's no question about it. because they are not thinking the way we think, right? These are people that have a different view of the world. Another positive is that 10/7 brought about an awakening among global Jewry. And you're looking here at the um, fundraising um, outcomes, which are incredible. The amount of money that was being raised locally in Jewish communities and for Israel, I think it really re energized Jewish communities. You can see that, and I love to show this slide because it's the school where I teach. So when you look at the number of unicorns funded by graduates of universities from all over the world outside of the United States. Okay, so the number one university that produced more CEOs of unicorns, a unicorn is a company that is worth more than $1 billion. The number one university is Tel Aviv University. And it's actually the school where I teach, the Kohler School of Management, with 17 and engineering majors 26. So Tel Aviv University is leading the world outside of the United States in the number of unicorn leaders it produced, unicorn funders it produced. Now, if you include American universities, Tel Aviv University is number 7 in the world. Now, that shows you that Israel still maintains its competitive edge in the sense that Israel is able to produce um, more and more knowledge that matters, knowledge that serves the world, that has a positive impact on the world, positive contribution. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is a decline in the way the world is seeing Israel. And it's understandable because the markets don't like wars, they don't like geopolitical instability. And so Israel's credit ratings are going down. It means that the ability to borrow cheap money is also limited. Money will be more expensive for Israel in the global markets. That will affect Israeli economy immediately because everything will become more expensive. Real estate will become more expensive. Buying a car would be more expensive. Going to the supermarket will be more expensive. And the risk is that the young people that have a choice, people that can relocate because they work in technology or can relocate because they have a second passport, will actually take advantage of that um, possibility and leave the country. And the people that will leave the country are the people that are giving Israel the competitive edge. So we estimate that if only 100,000 young Israelis in high tech will leave Israel, this will have a devastating impact on Israel's economy, on Israel's future. Another positive, which the world doesn't see, and I forgive me for the spelling mistakes here. I didn't turn on my spell check, I guess. Um, when it comes to Israel's military response, the collateral damage is actually being held on an impressive level. And here, we received this information from a friend of mine, an academic, a professor at university. And you see, these are the numbers of uninvolved civilians that were killed during American operations, military operations in Afghanistan, Somalia, Pakistan, and Yemen, and you can see the numbers. And Israel is doing actually pretty good, pretty well when you compare Israel to the performance of the United States. And by the way, most of those incursions by the Americans were done when Mr. Obama was in the White House. It's important to notice that. It's one of my most favorite quotes from a great book, which was an inspiration to me as a young man, called The Good Soldier Schweik, was written about a soldier during World War One. Schweik is a legendary character in the world of culture. There were many plays, and I think that this was even um, when I was in high school, it was a very popular book among my peers. And Schweik produced many, many memorable quotes. This is one of the most important quotes in the book. It says, "The first duty of the soldier is to survive, the second is to remember." And what does it mean? It means that, if you don't really remember why you're doing what you're doing, because that's the most important thing, is to remember the horrors of war, is to remember the price attached to it. And I think that's what we're seeing in Israel today. Another positive is that the level of support for Israel, despite of what is being communicated to us by our own media feed, social media feed, the level of support for Israel remains very, very high. This is from a campus study that asked students on campus, "What do you care about?" And you can see that the smallest number is the Middle East. So students on campus, and we're talking about 23 million students in the United States alone, care more about issues such as healthcare reform, climate change, gun control, and so on, immigration policies, than they do care about the situation in the Middle East. And again, contrary to the popular sentiment, the vast majority of Americans support Israel. I'm talking about levels that we have not seen since 1967. 84% in some studies put the blame of what is happening squarely on Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. So the people know something that their leadership seem to have forgotten. Um, Going into the future, here's a glimpse to what you're looking at. Children per family by sector for 2020 to 2022. So this is before the war. And you can see that the average ultra Orthodox woman gives birth to 6.4 children. The very religious Jewish woman gives birth to 6.1. The Orthodox Jewish woman brings 3.8. Traditional Jewish women, which means they're not practicing, but I call it the non-observant Orthodox Israeli, 2.4. The secular Israelis on average, 2 children. Muslim, 3. Druze, 1.9, and Christian in Israel, 1.8. This is based on Tel Aviv University study. Now, what does it mean? It means that if you're looking for an explanation how Israel is going to become a nation with 18 million people, right now we're a little bit over 10 million people. By 2048, when Israel will celebrate its 100-year anniversary, we're expected to be 18 to 19 million people. This is how it's going to happen. It's an important statement about the future. We see a decline in direct foreign investment, meaning money that comes straight into the Israeli economy, either by going in as an investment into an existing enterprise or as an entirely new enterprise. So in Israel, there's a tendency to say, well, the decline is only related to the war. But actually, when you see what's happening in Israel, Europe, and the United States, Israel is the blue line, Europe is the green line, and the United States is the red line. You can see that 2024 was a very bad year across the board. And it's true that Israel is performing very similar to the United States. Europe is a little bit above, but there is a decline, a global decline in the amount of money that goes in. And that can be explained, I think, by the general notion of uncertainty, of geopolitical uncertainty, that is not just unique to the Middle East. Again, I showed you those numbers before, but it's important to say it. 84% of the American people put the blame on Hamas for whatever is happening now. It's very important that we remember that, because we have a tendency to think that everybody's against Israel. It's not true. It's not true. Um, yeah, so this is, again, we spoke about that. Look at how different generations look at the war. We do have a problem with millennials and Gen Z, with the younger generation. But even there, there's still significant support for Israel, even among Gen Z and millennials. So I'd like to conclude by saying, the jury is still out, as we said always. We don't really know what kind of Israel will emerge out of 10-7, but we do know that there were positives and negatives in the year. The number one negative is the fact that we failed in bringing about the release of the hostages. This is a very dangerous failure because it could undo, really, the secret fabric that holds Israeli society together. And I think we are over the time allotted for this. So let me, at this point, end the presentation and take your questions.